the environment your child is growing up in is very, very different from what you experience, right? When you look into the data, majority of them are last 15 to 20 years. Some of them even, closer to us compared to that. But let's just say 20 years. That means if you're 30, I'm not even talking about like 50 or 60. If you're 30, you never even experienced that growing up, right? That means by the time you were 10 or 12 or 15, that's when social media just started. That's how much the world has changed. Like these platforms that are so normal for us now, our stuff have not even been around for 3 decades.
What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Thoughtful Banter podcast. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to episode 61. We are blessed with our great guest, esteemed Shaykh Mahdi, all the way from Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for being here. Assalamu alaikum.
Absolutely. Wa alaikum assalam. Nice to see you guys.
Good to see you as well. We've been talking about this for a while.
Alhamdulillah.
Finally came to the area. We wanted to make a trip out to Dallas, but inshallah next time.
Inshallah.
But you were able to grace us with your presence here in Maryland.
Thank you.
Big MD. Inshallah, let's jump right into it. Mahdi,
Let's go. Bismillah. I'm nervous. I think this is it's a good nervous. It's like excited. We're always happy to have guests on, especially very awesome guests like Shaykh Mahdi. So this is like a wordy question, but I'm gonna try not to read off the script because it's gonna come off as choppy. Mashallah, you and your brother studied in Hausa together. Your brother being Shaykh Rastani, and you two came out of Hausa around the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you guys around 4 years ago started Misan Institute. And since then, you have around 5 podcasts out, and you have these courses that are like these 2-day all-intensive workshops where you teach people about specific topics. So along with the courses plus the podcast, it really seems like you two are changing how we are thinking and like how we're being introduced to Islam and Islamic concepts. I want to know, what was the thought process behind the courses and the podcast, and what's the long-term vision and goal there?
Sure. Yeah, so I think we started around 4 to 5 years ago. Of course, the founder is Shaykh Amin, so all credit goes to him in terms of the vision, the thought process, and what he had in mind. In a short way to explain, basically we have all these treasures that our scholars have worked on for years and years. Okay, content they've worked on, a deeper understanding of the faith that they've worked on. It's kind of all just sitting in books. A lot of them are in Farsi and Arabic. The number of books in our school of thought that has been translated is very, very little. The percentage is very, very little of what's actually our scholars have worked on.
And then good translations is like,
and then that's
smaller.
another thing, whether the translation's good or not. And then the other thing is, even when the book is translated, a lot of this content typically needs to be taught. It's not the type of thing that I can just go pick up and read, right? Because a lot of times there's philosophical principles involved, there's other principles of different sciences and so on and so forth. So the thought process was, let's have an avenue for people who want to learn more about their faith without having to go and make a full-time commitment to study in the Hausa. So in one line, that's basically the vision behind Misan Institute. And so we have, our approach is a little bit of a mix. We have a lot of emphasis on in-person events. And so that's why the courses are, such an important part of what we do. And it really makes a huge difference. I mean, I've taught online and then I've taught in person, sometimes the same content. And the questions that come up, the way you interact with the community that you're visiting and so on and so forth. So we try to do a little bit of a mix, but of course, you can't visit every city. Yeah. And so that's obviously not doable. And so we have to do some stuff online as well. But yeah, the courses are the staple program that we do with Misan. Then there's podcasts, there's online presentations, there's Sister Fatima Meghji, she does an amazing job with the whole sisters side, and that's exclusively for sisters, so the brothers can't even attend, basically. Yeah. So
I get kind of upset about that, honestly.
I know, right?
I was able, a couple years ago, I was able to experience a couple classes taught by her at Life.
Yeah,
2017. And then after that, it's basically been exclusively like sisters.
Yeah.
So I got a taste, and now like.
And I was
Yeah.
upset about that too. And I realized I was like, why am I so angry? Because I was like bitterly watching all the sisters around her asking questions. I was like, I can just jump in there and ask questions.
Well, the sisters would tell you, go ask a male Molana, right?
That's exactly what my
they'll
wife
like.
told me.
Exactly
She's like, now you know how it feels. I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, we don't just jump in and ask like a Molana what we want. So
Yeah.
I guess it's only fair at this point.
Yeah, no, alhamdulillah, she's doing a really amazing job in every city I go to. One of the sisters walks up to me, one or more, walk up to me and tell me, oh, I know about Misan Institute because of Sister Fatima's different classes, courses. She has very long-term, long-form classes, and then she has like smaller units as well. And so that was basically the thought process behind Misan Institute. And it was also to become a platform so that other scholars and other speakers, if they have an interest in a particular area, they can just plug their content into a platform that is already connected with a lot of communities, has like a place for itself online. So it can become a place where scholars that come out of Hawza, inshallah, have a place where beyond just lecturing in different centers and so on and so forth, they have a place where they can come and provide their content to the community in this particular format, basically.
Like you said, there's so much content before that are just in books. And I've heard this before, and I truly can't really comprehend it, and beyond just content we have in books, I know we have like hundreds of books that have been burned before that we'll never really, potentially ever see. But with all the content that you have access to that we don't, how do you decide what's a course or what's a podcast worth making, right? How do you prioritize what information people need to see first, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So every scholar, by the way, will have a different approach on this issue. For me, I typically look at two elements in terms of getting into a topic and discussing it deeper, sometimes through Misan or even sometimes through the lectures that we do. So one element for me always is this something that Islam has spoken about? And is it something that Islam has spoken about extensively? So there are certain topics that are actually very much part and parcel of our life. Islam hasn't spoken about them extensively, right? And then there's other topics that may not seem like we deal with them every single day, but Islam has spoken about them extensively, right? It's a set of knowledge that Islam shared with us, even though it's not necessarily something we deal with every day, right? So I'll give you guys a typical example, jinn, right? Like none of us is running into jinn. Well, I hope not, right?
Yeah, no.
And but when you look into Quran and Hadith, even if you don't say extensively, there's definitely a lot of mention of it between the narrations and the verses of the Quran and everything. So that means Islam cares about it. And that means it's worthy of some level of discussion. So that's one element. But the second more important element is, what are the questions that people have and what are the issues that people are dealing with, right? So for me, it's interesting. I was in this city 4 years ago. A brother came up to me and asked me a question that turned into the topic of one of my Muharram lectures, because I thought this is an important question. A lot of people have this question, and it's important to clarify this topic. So for me, the questions I get from people, whether it's in person or on social media, that's a big indication. One of the biggest elements I keep in mind. And same thing with Misan Institute as well, is like some of those topics that we feel like this is something that is relatable to people, but then Islam has also spoken about it, shared about it, and the overlap of those two is like the golden scenario you're looking for.
Was there any like pushback from maybe like different communities in the Dallas area in the beginning of Misan? Like, because I know oftentimes what happens when new groups are started, even if it's not with the intent of drawing people away from the masjid necessarily, that's often like a critique that's levied at them, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you're pulling people away from our programming.
Yeah.
Did you guys deal with that? And I guess my question would be like, how did you navigate and how do you kind of placate the leaders, the elders in those communities as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think with Misan, we didn't deal with it too much, and the reason why was Misan was never meant to be a local thing.
Okay.
It was always meant to be a platform that serves the Shia school of thought across the world. Now we can say that, you know, when we were starting out 4 years ago, it was basically the States, right? And now, alhamdulillah, it's grown to a point where we have instructors flying to the UK, flying to Australia every year.
Oh.
And so, alhamdulillah, it's grown a lot. But I don't think we dealt with that in particular. Now, in some of the other endeavors I've had with the local center that we initiated in Dallas, it's called City of Knowledge. So that one, of course, that we had to have a particular approach and so on and so forth. And not so much with Misan. Yeah.
Okay.
We were doing research beforehand, of course, because we don't want to ask you questions that you've already answered before in other podcasts.
Sure.
Mashallah, you kind of been on a podcast tour. We saw you on the Not From Here podcast with the host, Brother Jaffa, over in Michigan, right?
Yeah.
And you also were on the After Maghrib show in UK, so international.
Mr. International.
Mr. International, indeed. And when you were on After Maghrib, there was a point where, like, I feel like, in a good way, you went off script. Like, I could see, like, you got, like, very passionate about the subject, and you were just kind of like, they were letting you cook, basically. Like, you're getting really into it.
That's very kind of you.
And it was like, when you were being asked about, like, you were just saying, like, what are we prioritizing? Because you're being asked about, like, you see youth in the community, parents would come to you, and they'll be like, oh, my kid now isn't praying. And you're looking at the situation, and it's like 14, 20 years. You had no Islamic priorities. And now the kid's coming to you now is like, I don't pray. It's like the issues began way before then.
Yeah, too late at this point, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
I guess if you could just speak on what you think it is in our communities that we're getting wrong in terms of education and just teaching Islam. What are we getting wrong with
education, prioritization?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff,
Yeah, I mean, I think I would rephrase the question and be like, what are we getting right? That's how many things we're getting wrong, honestly.
Wow.
You know, like, I would say probably the majority of what we're doing is probably not done properly. There are, of course, some things we're getting right, but I think there's, and I've had this conversation with a lot of our own community members, because when we started City of Knowledge, the question that came to mind was, well, we already have centers, so why are we starting a new one, right? And that's a very valid question, and a question that everyone who wants to start any organization needs to have a proper answer to. So the answer there for me was, well, the vision is very different here, okay? So I think there's at least these two elements come to my mind very easily. Well, we'll make it three to add the last one. One thing is a matter of leadership, right? So priorities are going to come from leadership. If you don't have the right leadership, then you're not going to be able to set the right priorities, right? So that leadership has to have two elements at least. Is one, it has to be a person / group of people, whatever, an entity that understands the needs of the community. And that would primarily be the needs of our up-and-coming generations. So it has to be a leadership that even understands that. Okay, so in a lot of situations, it's not even the case. It's good intentions, but there is a lack of understanding because they may not be from this generation and a lot of other reasons, you know? So that's one thing leadership needs to have. And the other thing that leadership needs to also have is a firm understanding of the faith, right? So if I'm running a clinic, I can't have, like, someone who's not an expert run this clinic. I need a doctor in there, right? And what we've done in our masajid, in our centers, is usually the leader is not the person with the expertise. So there's a major issue there. So that's number one. And this is, by the way, none of this is like, rocket science.
Yeah, it's not
these
novel.
These are like the basics, right?
Yeah.
And if you want to look at it in a much better way, like in the Sunni school of thought, right? You have to give them credit in terms of how they've been able to put together their organizations. And of course, every school of thought and every religion struggles with this issue. But I think you have a lot more successful examples to learn from. So that's leadership number one. Number two, our organizations, masajid, community centers, whatever you want to call them, they don't have welcoming environments. It's not the type of environment where I feel welcomed to attend. And it's not the type of place I feel like I want to connect with other people there. Sometimes there's not even an opportunity to connect with other people there because you're like, okay, so what's the event? Nothing. It's just a lecture, and then everyone, goes home, for example, Okay, so where am I going to socialize? Where am I going to have a chance to sit with other people who are my peers, right? And, have a good time with them. Are we ever going to come to the masjid and just spend time and just chill here, right? And make this feel like our home, so a lot of those elements are missing. And number 3 is deeper Islamic knowledge. Our organizations typically are scratching the surface when it comes to Islamic knowledge. And this is the part where I get a little passionate. In today's day and age, that does not work. It does not work. The questions are too many. The challenges are too many. The, you want to call it shubahat or whatever, are too many. There's too many isms. And so you need to dedicate, that needs to be a priority. How do we answer this question? How do we address this? Now, for an organization, that means what type of speakers are we inviting? What type of time are we allocating to them? How much of our budget is going towards this? I mean, I'm speaking from a perspective of being in an organization and seeing there's all these details that goes into it. So yeah, this part, I mean, we have not even touched. I gave the example a couple of weeks ago in Jummah Salat. It was the birth of Lady Fatima, salawatullahi salamu alayha, and I said it's not enough for us to sit back and say Lady Fatima was amazing. That's important. That's like 10% of what we need to do. And then there's another 90%. Well, how does that apply to me? What does her life mean for me? She got married at a younger age. What does that mean for today's world? What was her dress code like? What does that mean for today? What was her role in family? What does that mean for these are all different in today's day and age. So we have to have all these conversations, but typically we're only focused on basically saying the praises of these individuals. And that's not going to cut it. That's not going to cut it. We're going to have a generation coming up that is, and by the way, my own generation was neglected in this way as well. But we have to prevent it for the next generation. We're going to have a generation that's going to come up, and religion is just going to be something on the side. Yeah, I'm Muslim, but not really.
I'm culturally Muslim.
Yeah.
I mean, it's happening now.
40-day Muslim.
Yeah.
I've met a lot of people. I was telling a story to Mahdi, actually, a coworker of mine. I found out he was Muslim after, spending time with him.
Yeah.
And seeing him not really practice. And then I found out he was Muslim because Ramadan came along and someone told me he was fasting. I was like, what?
Yeah, and to be 100% clear, there's nothing wrong if someone is in that position where they're only practicing certain elements of the faith. That's not a bad starting point. That's amazing, right? The point is, what is the organization supposed to do to deepen the faith of this person, or at least try to help them along this path?
So what would you recommend to places I know Texas, for example, has a plethora of great scholars. We have a lot of good scholars here as well. Maryland, Virginia.
Yeah.
What about communities that don't have as much access to scholars? And even if they wanted to have a scholar on their leadership, on the board of their leadership, for example, or lead their masjid, they don't necessarily have access to that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes they can't even discern what speaker to invite for what thing.
Yeah.
Because they don't even have the expertise. And so they might invite a speaker and the guy starts going off. Yeah. And he's because everyone that wears a turban is not the same, obviously.
Yeah.
Not the same level, not the same intentions.
Sure.
All of these things are kind of layered here.
I mean, if you don't have that option, you just have to deal with that situation. What I've seen a lot of places do is they have an alim board. And so they consult a number of other scholars on the issue, So those are scholars that are not present in their community, but are outside of the community, But the thing is, those scholars ideally would have to be people who are born and raised here, again, understand all those, the needs and so on and so forth. So at least you can consult them, But the scholar's not going to be there directly to implement those issues.
Sorry, I have one more question. Go. As far as implementing a hierarchy or implementing an organization to an Islamic center or a community, I guess how do you kind of have the checks and balances on the power? Because sometimes what I've seen is that if it's a dictatorship, we're going to dictatorship, where one person is calling the shots, it's a great person. Say they happen to be a great leader. Yeah. And they're doing all the right things. And then that person, eventually is going to get old. Eventually is going to move out of that position. The next person comes up is nowhere near the same page.
Yeah.
Or someone comes up, they say the right things, but they actually have bad intentions. Kind of how should we? Because that's always going to be a never-ending kind of struggle, right?
Yeah.
Even if you do have the ideal and perfect kind of structures in place and guidelines for how to go about appointing people, kind of how do you think communities should put checks and balances on those kind of things?
I mean, that's
this is like the nitty or gritty.
Yeah. So I'll give a quick answer to that. I think, first of all, there always needs to be, if you're in that position where you have someone who's doing a good job, while he's there needs to be a plan for succession, in the sense that this person would have to have some sort of say in terms of who else is going to come and continue down this path, right? In an ideal world, before the new person comes, they come while this person is still, doing the stuff that he's doing in the community. They get a chance to observe. They get a chance to see how things are run, so on and so forth. Now, that's ideal. It may not always be possible, but the alim or alima, whatever the situation might be, should have a say in terms of who else is going to come next. So that's one big important thing. And then the other thing is, depending on the community, because every community is different and every audience is different, you would come up with some checks and balances in terms of, okay, well, if the alim, for example, goes completely off rails, like, what are we going to do about it, right? So that would have to do with your constitution and how you want to approach that particular situation. That gets very detailed in terms of the particular communities.
Yeah.
But every community does need to have some framework. Now, the framework needs to be a little bit broad, because the work of an alim is, in reality, it is broad, right? So, like, as an alim, what do I deal with? Okay, well, this person's daughter wants to get married, right? So they want to have a premarital consultation. This person is having marital issues. That's a completely different situation. This person wants to calculate their financial dues. Completely different. This person just wants to sit down and see what he wants to do with his life. So it's like this wide range. So there needs to be flexibility, and I think our centers sometimes struggle with that in terms of giving the scholar some flexibility, so that he can dedicate his time the way he sees fit. But yeah, these are deep issues. Yeah, these are complicated issues. Yeah,
I love it, and I know we can't sit you down for 6 hours and extract all the answers out of you.
Yeah.
Going back to how a community should be, it really seems like right now we need less masjids or mosques, and we need more community centers, places where people can play ping pong, play video games, go swimming, play basketball. And to me, in my mind, that almost seems like not just a community issue, but also kind of a money issue, right? I just want to know your thoughts on that, because from what you're saying, it sounds like what I just described, kind of like almost like a YMCA kind of space. Would you agree with that? Or
I think so. I'll rephrase your point. I wouldn't say we need less masjids and more community centers. I would say we need more true masjids. And a true masjid, the way the Prophet had intended for it to be, was for it to be a community center. So that doesn't mean it's a place where you don't pray. No, it's a place you come, you pray. It's a place where you hold Jummah. It's a place you do all these things. But it's not just for this. And that's kind of the way we've understood it, which is not correct. So when the Prophet started, when he came to Medina, it might surprise some people. Like, when he's building his community in Medina, what's the first thing that he did? Before he even made it into Medina, he built a masjid, which is known as Masjid al-Quba, right? So, which is the first masjid in the world of Islam ever. And then when he made it in, Masjid al-Nabi, of course, afterwards, right? And then they expanded the masjid, right? So historians have put down some details and they wanted to make like this bigger, I'm calling it a facility. It wasn't really a facility, right? But like a bigger masjid. And the Prophet told them, no, he started with something smaller. And then as the crowd grew, the masjid expanded over time. And it was a very simple facility. It was a very simple setup. But that was actually the first thing that the Prophet did. Now, when he built a masjid, was the masjid for the Prophet only a place where people go and pray? No, it was a place where people would get married. It was a place where people used to come and deal with their issues. Oh, I need help from you. Can you help me? Oh, how's your relative? What's going on? So on and so forth. It was a place where people would come and learn. It's a place of knowledge. You've heard that hadith. Prophet came into the masjid. One circle was discussing knowledge. The other circle was praying. And the Prophet went with the group that was learning knowledge. So that means there were people in the masjid. They were learning, teaching, all of that kind of stuff, right? So all of these functions of the masjid, unfortunately, we've set them aside. And the masjid has only turned into like maybe a third or fourth of what it needs to be. And so now we say, okay, well, no, the masjid was the center of the community during the time of the Prophet. When they wanted to make big announcements, everyone was at the masjid, right? When someone would pass away, there was things that happened at the masjid, not necessarily the ceremonies, but maybe for the salat on the body and so on and so forth. So that's what my approach would be, is how do I take this masjid and do it the way the Prophet did within our context today. So no one's gonna come in the masjid today and be like, I want to get married. Is there anyone who can help me, right? But you might want to come and play ping pong, right? You might want to come and play video games. You might want to come and connect with other peers and other people who are your same age that you feel comfortable with. So that's kind of what I would say about that, yeah.
And then again, as far as like crafting the ideal community,
Yeah.
what are some of, like, in your opinion, the main institutions that should be strong in those communities?
What do you mean by
so
institutions?
Institutions, I mean like education, like
Like the pillars, you mean?
Yeah, like the pillars.
So I'll give you kind of the vision that we had in mind when we started, with our own organization. And this was like almost 5 years ago. But we sat down and we said, okay, there's 3 pillars that I think every masjid/community center, if it's a religious community center, would need. First of all, it has to be a place of worship and a place where people come and remember God, hereafter, and so on and so forth. That's pillar number 1. Now, a lot of things are going to fall under that, but, that's the first pillar. Pillar number 2 has to be a place of learning, education, deeper understanding of the faith. Number 3, it also has to be a place of social services. So those social services could mean a whole list of things. It can be a place where people come, I don't know, for example, there's loans that are given out, or it's a place where there's blood drives that happen, or it's a place where people come together and have festivals and build community and so on and so forth. But those 3 pillars is essentially what, that's why on our logo it says faith, education, service, right? So those are the 3 elements.
That's such an exciting, when I'm getting like goosebumps, such an exciting idea. Like you think of like an Islamic utopia. Of course we won't have that until our Imam arrives, but
Inshallah.
it's just very invigorating. And like when I think of myself, like I would love, us two growing up, our parents kept us in the masjid, probably just for like free babysitting, right? But like it was a very comfortable space for us. And more comfortable for us than probably a lot of the other kids who maybe stopped coming. And even for us, at some point, like you're like, yeah, this is boring. Like are we just learning Islam here? Luckily for us, we have been to centers before where people just play around and have fun, wrestle. Even though it's probably not the best masjid etiquette. It creates an atmosphere where at least we felt comfortable. Like we felt like this is our home. So we're proud of being there and we will spend our weekends there. But it's very invigorating to think of a place that's like not just a masjid. Like maybe there's a pray hall, but like this is like a cafe zone where like you can like, kind of like we work, come work here, be productive if you're studying or you guys are entrepreneurs, and there's financial advising, or like why isn't there like a masjid like community therapist? God knows we have how many mental health problems.
The needs that our community has it's such a long list, right? Yeah. And of course, you mentioned funding before. Yeah, of course, in every single one of these issues, funding is going to come up. There's no doubt about that. That is because we have to be practical about these issues, right? So funding is going to come up in a lot of different ways. And the idea is not that, okay, well, you started this organization, okay, it has to like take care of all of the needs that the whole community. No, but the idea is that the vision has to be that that's the direction we're moving in. Maybe today our abilities only allow us one of these needs, so we can take care of one of those needs. But are we planning and strategizing in a way that 10 years from now, 15, 20 years from now, it's grown into something that can be a lot more than that, right? So a lot of these needs that you're talking about, for example. But yeah, I mean, these are, again, this is not rocket science. These are some basics. And if you look within the Sunni community, they've done a really good job with it.
Yeah,
At least you have a lot of good examples. I know in Dallas we have great examples of this. So yeah.
No, we have that too. We have Adam Center. That's like not even a masjid. It's like a mall. Like, aren't there multiple buildings that are part of Adam Center, and like each one is massive? And I'm like walking. I was in there one time for like Miss, I remember, and I'm like, "Is this the masjid part?" Like, no, brother, this is just the school upstairs. The masjid. I'm like, "This is huge."
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, that's the ideal situation. And of course, but you put it within, smaller dimensions, right? That same vision, but in smaller dimensions, right? Because obviously numbers are not the same or even close to the same between the two schools of thought. But you put it into smaller dimensions, similar, approach and so on and so forth. Then you have something, like you're saying, exciting. You have something that you're like, oh, wow, like I can be a part of this. I can serve the community. My own family can benefit from it. And like, oh, my kids will have a place where I don't have to drag them every single time. Sometimes they'll want to come with me because, yeah, there's a lecture, but guess what? The speaker knows how to speak in a way to engage them. And then afterwards, for example, they'll go up to the youth lounge and chill there. And we're going to be downstairs, right? And we're going to have a family night. They'll have their place. We'll have our place. And like that vision, I think the majority of us growing up here never experience, at least in this way. And it can be very exciting. Of course, it's not easy to make it happen. It's very difficult, but that's kind of the thought process.
Kind of going back to the unideal circumstances that some of our communities are in and experiencing. You mentioned the youth specifically and the issues that they face that are different than even 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I guess getting into like the nitty gritty of these things, at least some of the biggest things that jump out to you, what are they? And then what do you think is the best approach for a scholar like yourself? And then also even a community member that notices these things to address them or kind of try to help them along.
So I think I told a parent once when I was trying to explain to them that the environment your child is growing up in is very, very different from what you experience, right? And so the way I explained it to them was like, I was like, you've heard of social media, right? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, do you know when these major social media platforms started, when they began? And when you look into the data, majority of them are last 15 to 20 years. Some of them even, closer to us compared to that. But let's just say 20 years. That means if you're 30, I'm not even talking about like 50 or 60. If you're 30, you never even experienced that growing up, right? That means by the time you were 10 or 12 or 15, that's when social media just started. That's how much the world has changed. Like these platforms that are so normal for us now, our stuff have not even been around for 3 decades. And so parents struggle to understand that. And sometimes, unfortunately, they're a bit naive, about understanding that. So what was the other part of your question? I forgot the other part of your question.
Basically, like the biggest issues you see amongst the youth.
Yeah.
And then like what do you think should be our path to kind of tackling it?
We need like proper foundational organizations that can cater to them, right? So catering to them means, okay, we're going to do this event. Is it youth friendly, for example? This lecture, what type of speaker are we going to bring in? What is the message he's going to deliver? And this is one part of it. What other events are we going to design, organize? What type of environment are we going to design for the younger generation to feel comfortable, Now, the younger generation has its own struggles and its own shortcomings. There's no doubt about this. Every generation has their own shortcomings. Like one of the shortcomings of this generation, is up-and-coming generation, is that they're just sometimes too chill. Like they're too mellow, right? So like, and that's what a lot of parents notice actually, right? They're like, oh, well, he needs to be putting in more effort. He needs to be doing more. And, this 18-year-old is like, no, I'm fine. Everything will be fine, And I've seen that in action where a lot of youth say, okay, well, we need to do this. We need to do that. And then you're like, okay, so step up and help out with it. But they won't step up some of them, right? So that's their own shortcoming that they have. Like every generation has their own shortcoming. But if we have organizations that start to cater to our younger generation, then over 10, 15 years, you will see the results of it.
The fruit of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think is like? It's like an everything issue. It's like a funding. It's just more like, I think it's more of, it's an attention issue.
Yeah.
Because like wherever you have your attention to, that's where that's where the physical action happens. That's where the funding happens. But it's like, do we just not care about our youth? You know, it just seems like, do we just care more about having like masjid theatrics? Basically, it's like people are just trying to recreate this home theater model that we had. Like when I say home theater, like from the motherland theater.
Yeah.
Like, oh, Muharram looked like this. We just, if the masjid is blacked out and we have some great speakers in Muharram and the masjid is packed, then it's a success, right?
Yeah.
Is that
So
the
I
thinking?
mean, it can have a lot of different reasons. I really think our elder generation, to be honest, and this might sound counterintuitive, I think they did a really good job with what was available to them, what was at their disposal. Okay, a lot of them came from countries where you didn't have to lead a religious community. There was an alim, there was someone who was leading it for you.
Yeah.
Then they came here. A lot of them might be professionals or maybe not, whatever the case might be. They're making a living here, and then like they're like, oh, by the way, you have to like start a religious community, right? And a lot of them were in cities where there was nothing, right? I remember sometimes we used to drive 5 hours to get halal food as a kid, or halal meat. But like, so they came into this very weird situation. They did the best of what they could do. Sometimes it's there's practical elements to this as well. But the only part where I'd say like, maybe some are at fault is like now when you do have sometimes other alternatives and a better way of approaching things, there's resistance, right? So that resistance doesn't really make sense, right? So like, okay, you weren't able to pull it off. That's okay. I mean, you did really good with what you had, but just understand that now the times have changed. The needs have changed. I mean, I say now, this is like 15 years ago. Okay, like 20 years ago, things changed. I'm being like very generous saying now, right?
Yeah.
That's why there's generations of our community that are not connected to their faith or to the masjid or whatever the case might be. Like we lost those generations already. So now there's a new start. There's a new approach. The resistance is, something that you say, well, you can't resist it because it has to happen. Yes, it has to happen under a scholar. It has to happen under an alim so that, in our approach, we know what are those things that were cultural and what are those things that were religious. And so we don't start getting rid of those things that are religious thinking that they were cultural. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that our generation makes.
We've seen communities here do that, right? Like we have people here who are like putting in a good effort.
Yeah.
They're trying to make like a community that's like, okay, we just want Islam. And we're trying to be like, we're trying to be Muslims who are American. So we're trying to have American culture.
Yeah.
Leave out the bad parts of the culture, but take away the culture parts of Islam.
Yeah.
But some of the stuff they're taking out that are culture are religion.
Exactly.
Like,
Throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. So you need expertise first to be able to say, okay, this is cultural. This is religious. So then I can say, okay, well, this is cultural. We can take it easy on this side because culture changes, but religion isn't going to change. So I can take it easy and be like, okay, well, you guys used to do it this way. We're going to do it this way now. But like you said, a lot of times organizations, this generation, because they don't have an expertise in this field, the same way I'm not an expert in a million other fields, they'll point to something completely religious. And they'll be like, well, we don't believe in this.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of the dilemma.
It's funny because when I saw you on the After Maghrib podcast, you were talking about this person, it's just maybe a hypothetical person, and you were like, oh yeah, public schools, like, it's fine. It's okay. Like, I made it out okay. And you're like, listen, like, okay, yeah, you can. We're talking about the likelihood. Like, yeah, you made it out okay. Count how many people walked out of public school Muslim and came out non-Muslim, for instance, or not practicing.
That was transitioning to the topic of kids and children and everything. So schooling is one element. It's not the only element, right? What the family does is really, really important. But now, especially with how schools have developed, that element has become so important. And it's become, unfortunately, in some situations, extremely damaging. So if I just hand my kids off and say, hey, yeah, have them for 8 hours, and then, we'll see them at the end of the day, then that's a completely different situation, And so that's a major, major issue that we have. Education, schooling is something our community needs to start investing in, needed to start investing in, like yesterday. But we haven't done it up until now, so we need to start investing in it now that everyone understands the need. 10, 15 years ago, most people didn't understand the need. Now, with all the stuff that's happening and, LGBTQ and whatnot, now we're like, okay, now people who may have not understood before, even they are understanding now. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I tell parents, I'm like, listen, if I give my child good schooling, right? And then I also have a family that's concerned about the upraising or the upbringing of my child, the likelihood of my child not ending up on the right path, in general, connected to his faith, is very low. That's just the reality of it. It's not rocket science, okay? Every other minority, they have their own schools, they have their own education, they know how to approach it in a way that is in line with their values. It's our community that's, fell behind in this area. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also an aspect here where, and me and Mahdi talk about this all the time, but
yeah,
we also start looking at the typical, what society considers prestige.
Yeah.
And we make that our goal.
Yeah.
And a lot of times to get those things that are prestige, you also have to work within the system that's here.
Yeah.
Which is how we get like the influx of Muslim kids in public school, for example, because they have to get good grades so they can go to Ivies. For examples. I guess, how do we go about kind of reframing those incentives and reframing the ideas that people have, even about the prestige of Ivy League schools or graduating from with this degree from this big school?
I mean, listen, I think if a child is raised with proper character, proper values, confidence in his faith, confidence in knowing who he is, why he's here on this earth, where he's headed, I think there is nothing that he cannot achieve. So this idea that there's a dichotomy, either you're connected to your faith or you succeed in life. I'm not sure who taught us that. No. Yes, there's sacrifices you have to make on the way. But if you are someone who understand your values connected to your faith, as far as I'm concerned, you have a better shot at succeeding, even if that success that we're defining has some material aspects to it, some material elements to it. Now, of course, Islam's not going to tell you to go live, your life on some yacht and, be luxurious and extravagant and so on and so forth. But reaching a point where you are an asset to your community, you're resourceful, whether that's your education or the business and the entrepreneurial effort that you started, either of those, you have a better shot. Your child will have a better shot at doing that if they know who they are and they know their values and they're connected to their faith. So I don't see a dichotomy there at all. Especially the way the marketplace has changed, and you guys would know this. It's no longer just about the grades, and that used to be the case for back in the day. Now it's about how driven are you, how much passion do you have, how much work ethic do you have, how much discipline are you going to get the job done. And if you are a Muslim who's connected to his faith and doesn't work just for himself but works for a greater cause, you probably have a better shot at incorporating those things than anybody else. Now, yes, a lot of Muslims don't incorporate those things. That's on them. That's not on Islam. But if my child has the proper values, he can have a very good shot at being extremely successful.
Yeah. I just want to clarify. I don't think I wasn't trying to draw like a line between these two things. I was more saying like what I find happens is that we go into these spaces without we put kids into these spaces without them having that strong foundational view. And so what happens is they come out and they're the same as John Smith, who came out from the same school. And their behaviors and values and attitudes are the same. That's kind of more.
So I understand the idea that, okay, well, I have to put my child in this particular position because there's benefits that come with it. But you have to be very cautious about that during the childhood years. The childhood years are not to be compared with when this child is 18, 20, 25, 30. When he's 18, 20, 25, 30, whatever, he'll go into a million different situations and that don't necessarily align with his values because he has to be there for his career, whatever. That's completely fine. The childhood years, the world of this child is being built. You're setting the standards. You're setting what is normal, what's not normal. That's literally what a child is learning every single day. So during that time, his environment has to be a pure environment. So a lot of parents will say, well, I don't want my child to grow up in a bubble, for example, right? And to a lot of those parents, I ask them, like, if I had a video of a cow being slaughtered, right? Can I show that to your child? Every parent, if it's like a very young child, right, they'll say no. Why? It's violence. So you're keeping your child in a bubble from certain angles.
Yeah.
Certain things you understand you have to protect your child from. Well, that's the type of stuff that they're exposed to in schools and friends, so on and so forth.
Worse. Like
Not
if
worse,
you-
but it's worse.
It's way worse.
I'm using a PG-13 example.
I
you know?
love a cow. I mean, hey, that's what we're going to eat later. He
I'm
might
like-
be vegan for a week, traumatized. Like, he'll get back to it.
Like, show them the video of the food that they're gonna eat tonight. If I asked you to show them the video of the animal that was slaughtered for that, you would cover your child's eyes, as you should, right? Why? Because you're like, my child's not ready right now.
Comprehend it.
He can't comprehend it. He can't digest it right now. Right now, I'm building his world. If he sees that, he's going to assume that's normal. He's going to assume that's what he has to identify with. I don't want that. Same thing. It's the same thing. So we all have to protect our children. Yes, there's this extreme way of doing it that, oh my God, if my child sees one thing, he's going to lose his whole faith and he's just going to be kafir. And no, that means you didn't do a proper job teaching him.
Yeah.
Right? That means you
That's
had
the other
this
extreme, right?
Yeah, that's the other extreme. You had a very superficial approach. Now you're afraid, God forbid, he sees anybody or talks to anybody. And by the way, kids growing up nowadays, if they have a phone, it's impossible to keep them in a bubble anyways.
Yeah, they've seen it all.
They've seen it all. Like, it doesn't matter where you live. Like, and it also doesn't matter, who your immediate family is. If my child has a phone at, hopefully not early on, hopefully later, they'll be exposed to a lot of different things, and hopefully there's controls over that and so on and so forth. But I assure you, they're not growing up in a bubble. Those days are somewhat over.
Yeah.
That's really scary. That kind of hit like a nerve when you said those days are over, because you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, even like, and we're right now we're talking about phones, but we see how much the iPhone went from the 1 to the 15 now, in the last whatever, like 10 years. I can't imagine in the next 20 years, are we even going to be holding phones, or are we going to be clicking the side of our head and seeing only what we want to see?
Yeah.
It brings a question of like, what does that balance look like? Because I think for myself growing up, I've witnessed both ends of like that overprotectiveness where, and I even see sometimes with some of the youth that I work with that are like, this kid is a little bit too in the bubble. Like at some point, it's like you are a little too assured even. It's like if your world's just a masjid and you think like knowledge is just spitting out hadith, it's like you're 13. Like, what are your hobbies? You don't got to teach me about Amir al-Mu'minin. Like, can we have some fun, bro?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
how do you
that's
have that balance.
I think parents need to be the judge of that, you know, and like I said, right now, the majority of our issue is not, protecting, is not, we're overprotecting them. The majority of the issue we have right now is that there's no guardrails, right? Like, I've seen kids 7 or 8, they have a phone. So what does that mean? Well, I know what that means. And I know what type of culture, values, content a child is going to be exposed to, at that age with a phone, right? Like, that means anything and everything is available, right, at this point. But the overprotecting is definitely an issue with some families. There's no doubt about that. There needs to be a balance, right? And so people will look at these extremes and be like, well, I don't want to be like that. Okay, so don't be extreme about it, right?
Yeah.
Take the moderate approach and do it properly. So
one thing that is, and I want to know your both of y'all's thoughts on this. I think that we struggle. I think a lot of people don't know how to live in the sense of like a lot of people don't have fun. Like a lot of people don't even have hobbies. They don't have anything they're interested in or passionate about. And I think the phone issue, one of the biggest issues with it is like the dopamine and the excitement. So I think the issue we have to overcome is you can take your kid's phone away from them, but they need some kind of excitement and dopamine in their lives. So if you take away stuff without giving them things in return, they're going to be deprived of just, I guess, stimulus. Like, I'm bored.
There needs to be other alternatives. There needs to be other options, whether that's, it's sports or it's hanging out with friends that you kind of understand their values are similar to your values. Yeah. Or if that means, whatever it means, there's all sorts of alternatives that we can come up with that can replace, the phone, at least becoming your number one buddy, right? That's a problem. If it's your number one friend, then that's a major issue. So I think parents can come up with alternatives. Usually the issue is a lack of understanding of, like, a lack of concern that, this is something serious. Yeah. And if my child is spending hours and hours on their phone, they're not spending time with their phone. They're spending time with the people who are behind the screen. And God knows who those people are. There's all sorts of people out there, right? Yeah.
A lot of people, especially recently, have been talking about some of the religious trauma that they've gone through, as far as like feeling like they're being judged feeling like they're being judged for things, and maybe having an incorrect perception of what God is and how he's supposed to be. And so my question to you is, like, how do we balance that idea of God being a merciful and kind being, as well as him having wrath and him having ghadab and anger? Yeah. So kind of like we often see people go from one side or the other. So that's where some of the trauma comes from, is you have someone, maybe an older person, is like, oh no, if you do this, you're going to go to hell. If you do this, you're going to go to hell. Yeah. And then those people often go all the way on the other extreme, which is like, oh no, you can do anything and God is just going to forgive you. Kind of how do we strike that balance?
So, of course, this is, I think, to be completely honest, it's a very nuanced topic. It's not as simple as people might assume it is. You and I might assume it is, but I think it's a very nuanced topic. So I'll mention two things, because obviously we can't go into too much detail on it. But there was a talk I did. It was called, avoiding judgment in our communities, or the title I actually gave it is "Don't Judge Me." So that goes into this whole topic of what does it mean when we say you can or you cannot judge someone or their actions. Simple answer to that is you can judge people's actions, including your own. You can't judge their character as a whole, right? So you can say, this is not a good thing to do. You can't sit there and say, well, you did this, you're definitely going to go to hellfire, right? Or you did this, God doesn't care about you, or God doesn't love you anymore, or God, don't come to the majlis anymore, right? So that... And of course, in that lecture, I go into a lot more detail. So for those who are interested in that, I would definitely recommend that. The other talk was it was called, Should I Fear a Merciful God? Right? And so that whole talk was about how do we bring these two elements together. And so when you look into our narrations in our literature, fearing God is typically understood as, by a lot of scholars, a lot of mufassirin, is understood in the sense that you understand that there are consequences to your deeds. You don't give yourself a green light to do whatever you want to do. And you live life with this guardrail that when you come across a sin, you say, no, I'm not supposed to be engaging in this, because this means I become worthy of the consequences that are come from this, which are the punishments. Okay? Now, do we believe that those punishments are God getting angry at you? No. The Quran does speak in that terminology. Well, the Quran has to speak to people from 1400 years ago to today, to hundreds of years later and counting. But a lot of scholars understand it in what sense? In the sense that what you're doing is not in line with God's will. Hence, there are consequences to your actions. And so a lot of scholars will tell you, when God has punishment on the Day of Judgment, he doesn't punish people. It is those deeds that have a spiritual reality present themselves on that day. That is what that punishment is. And there's a multitude of verses of the Quran to support this and to back this up. All of that to say, there is a balanced approach to this, which is, I have a lot of hope in God's mercy, but I'm never going to give myself a green light to sin, because I understand there are consequences that I am exposing myself to. So as long as I'm somewhere in there, this is the balanced approach. And so when the Quran says you have to fear God, doesn't mean you go sit in the corner of the room and like your hands are shaking all day and oh my God, like that's how you fear a dictator. What it means when it says you have to fear God, it means when you come across sin, you forbid yourself from that sin. That is fearing God in practice, okay? And of course, we know that it's technically you're not even fearing God. That's fearing yourself and what you're about to do, because you're the one who's involved in this. God's not even doing anything here. You're the one who has the free will. You're the one who might, end up doing something that has a negative consequence that's tied to the deed itself. And so technically you have to fear what you might do with your own free will. But the Quran says fearing God means I have to hold back. When I come to sin, I have to tell myself, this is not good. I'm not supposed to be engaging in it. So if I'm not giving myself a green light, when I come across sin, if I care enough to say, this is not good, I'm not supposed to be doing this, this is at the bare minimum a level of fearing God, which I would argue a lot of people actually have to a certain extent, maybe at a bare minimum. And then, yes, there are people who have a misunderstanding of our faith and understand it maybe closer to the way sometimes Christianity is preached.
Yeah.
Which is,
Jesus loves you.
Yeah, you're
He
good
died
to
for
go.
your sins.
Yeah, you have nothing to worry about. He already died for your sins. You're already purified, and so you can, it's still not good for you to do it, but there's no consequences per se.
Yeah.
Right? And Islam has that fundamental difference. No, there are consequences. Now, does it mean if you do this deed, how is it going to play out exactly in the hereafter? Well, there's a lot of details there. Maybe you did other good deeds that can potentially forgive this sin for you. Maybe you helped out someone that can potentially forgive this sin for you. There's a lot of maybes. That's the calculation on the day of judgment God has to do. But the Quran says, fear it enough to not even leave it to any of these maybes. Like, why are you leaving your future to a maybe? So someone asked me once, Shaykh, if I don't observe this dress code, for example, or if I don't fast, am I definitely going to end up in hellfire? I said, there's a problem with that question, because even if there's a chance of it, why would you even expose yourself to that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, the question shouldn't be, am I definitely going to end up there? So if the Prophet says, no, you won't definitely end up there, you'll be like, okay, we're fine. Right? The question should be, what do I do so I make sure I definitely don't end up there? Right? So even a maybe, why should I leave myself to a maybe? That's fearing God. Does it mean that sometimes I might fall short and end up doing the wrong thing? Sure. But as long as my general approach is, I'm not going to give myself just free reign, green light to do whatever I want to do.
Shaykh Mahdi, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries.
It's been a pleasure. We're going to wrap up with that, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. The first links below will be Shaykh Mahdi's links that he has given us. Make sure to follow him on Instagram. Make sure to check out his lecture series. Make sure to give the Misan Institute's website a follow. See if there's any workshops in your city that you can attend to soon, and support him for coming on the podcast. And with that, Assalamu alaikum.